Welcome to Introduction to Logic with Dr. Cecilea Mun. As we discussed in the previous lesson, there are three general steps to analyzing an argument, and how to carry out the first step of identifying all and only the statements that make up an argument. If you have yet to participate in that lesson, I suggest you do so now before you continue on with this one. You can find links to that lesson at the top right-hand corner of this screen and in the description box below. Step 1. Identify all and only the statements that make up an argument. Step 2. Identify which statements are premises and which statements are conclusions, including the main conclusion or conclusions. Step 3. Determine the way in which specific statements of an argument are related to each other, as premises and conclusions, in order to eventually support the main conclusion or conclusions. In today's lesson, you will learn about the second step of analyzing an argument and how it works together with the first step of identifying all and only the statements that make up an argument. You will also learn about the importance of diagramming and argument, which is the third and final step of analyzing an argument. We will begin with the questions. What are premise and conclusion indicators? What do they do? And how can we use them? Then we'll move on to learning about how diagramming an argument can be helpful. What are premise and conclusion indicators? Premise and conclusion indicators are words or phrases that are often used by people when presenting arguments to help others figure out which part of their argument is a premise and which part is a conclusion. Here is a list of typical premise indicators. Premise indicators: because,
Since,
given that, as indicated by,
due to the fact that, for the reason that,
seeing that, insofar as, in light of.
considering that.
Whenever these words or word phrases are used, the statement that follows these words or word phrases will usually be a premise. Here is a list of typical conclusion indicators. Conclusion indicators:
Therefore, thus,
hence,
consequently,
as a result, it follows that, accordingly, this implies that, which means that. In conclusion, whenever these words or word phrases are used, the statement that follows these words or word phrases will usually be a conclusion. What do premise and conclusion indicators do? One great thing about premise and conclusion indicators is that they are really helpful for identifying premises and conclusions in an argument. To use premise and conclusion indicators to identify premises and conclusions, it is important to first understand how to identify an argument, including differentiating it from something like an explanation. The reason is that many premise and conclusion indicators are also used in explanations. However, when these words or word phrases are used in explanations, they are not being used to indicate either a premise or a conclusion. They are instead being used to indicate the statement conveying the explananda or a statement constituting the explainans. For example, consider the sentence about Socrates being mortal that we spoke about in the earlier lesson on what makes arguments different. The example states that, if Socrates was human, then he was mortal. So, since Socrates was human, Socrates was mortal. Recall how we spoke about how we can identify this sentence as an argument based on the intention behind its use. If the intention behind the use of the sentence is to convince someone of the truth of the main point of the sentence, then it is an argument. We also spoke of how the context can help us identify this sentence as an argument. If this sentence is used in the context of someone doubting the truth of the main point of the sentence, then the intention behind the use of this sentence is most likely to convince someone of something, which would then make this sentence an argument. We also compared the sentence as an argument with the exact same sentence, which represented an explanation rather than an argument. The difference was that, as an explanation, the intention behind the use of this sentence would be to explain something rather than to convince someone of something, and we can identify this intention by the context in which the sentence is used. If the context is someone wondering or asking why or how something is the way it is, then the intention behind the use of this sentence is most likely to explain, which would make this sentence an explanation. Once again, notice that the two sentences, one as an argument and the other as an explanation, are exactly the same. The only differences are the intention behind the use of the sentence and the context. The point here was to highlight the significance that the intention of the use of a sentence makes, as well as the context. Another thing to notice here is the use of the words
so, and,
since. These are indicator words. Words like these are not considered to be a part of a statement, which is why they are always placed outside the statement brackets. Let's also go ahead and put each of them in parentheses to make it clear that they are not a part of a statement. Rather than being a part of a statement, indicator words instead tell us that a statement or statements that follow the indicator word will be something like a premise, conclusion, explainans, or convey the explananda. In the case of our example, the word
since
indicates that the statement that follows it, which is statement 2, Socrates was human, is either a premise or part of the explainans. The word
so
indicates that the statement that follows it, which is statement 3, Socrates was mortal, is either a conclusion or conveys the explananda. What determines whether these indicator words are premise or conclusion indicators, or indicates that a statement is part of the explainans or conveys the explananda, is the intention behind the use of the sentence. If the sentence is being used as an explanation, then the word
since
will indicate that statement 2, Socrates was human, is a part of the explainans. Thus, in this case, the word
since
would be an explainans indicator, and the word
so
will indicate that statement 3, Socrates was mortal, conveys the explananda, which would make the word
so
an explananda indicator. If the sentence is being used as an argument, then the word
since
will indicate that statement 2, Socrates was human, is a premise, and the word
so
will indicate that statement 3, Socrates was mortal, is a conclusion. So, whether an indicator word indicates a premise or conclusion, or whether it indicates an explainans or explananda, will depend on whether the sentence or passage is an argument or explanation, which would be determined by the intention behind the use of the sentence or passage. For the rest of this lesson, I'm going to assume that we are speaking only of arguments. So, all the sentences or passages we will be working with will be arguments, which means that all the indicator words that we will be discussing from this point on in this lesson will be either a premise or a conclusion indicator. Now, before we move on, you might have wondered why the word
so
indicates something about statement 3, Socrates is mortal, rather than indicating something about statement 2, Socrates was human, especially since it seems that statement 2 is the statement that follows the indicator word.
so
When trying to figure out which statement a premise or conclusion indicator is telling us about, you need to also make sure to pay attention to the grammatical structure of the sentence. In English, when a clause is introduced in between a sentence with the use of 2 commas, one at the beginning of the clause and the other at the end of the clause, what this tells us is that we can remove the clause, starting from the first comma and ending with the second comma, without disrupting the meaning of the remaining sentence. Once we do so, you should see that the conclusion indicator word
so
stays in front of statement 3, Socrates was mortal, and the premise indicator word
since
stays in front of statement 2, Socrates was human. This is how we know that the conclusion indicator
so
is an indicator word for statement 3 and the premise indicator
since
is an indicator word for statement 2. We also know
so
is a conclusion indicator and
since
is a premise indicator because this is simply how they are used when they are appropriately used in an argument. In other words, as with different kinds of sentences, it is also the case with words and word phrases that it is the intention behind their use which gives them their meaning, and all words have an appropriate intended use in a language. If you are not familiar with premise or conclusion indicators, the best thing to do to start becoming familiar with them is to simply memorize some of them and begin to attend to them when you read. And if you come across an indicator word in your readings that you are not sure about, simply check a dictionary to find out, and then add that word to the list of premise and conclusion indicators that you already know. Here is the list of typical premise indicators again. You might want to write them down if you are not already familiar with them as premise and conclusion indicators. Some premise indicators are because,
since, given that,
as indicated by,
due to the fact that, for the reason that,
seeing that, insofar as, in light of,
considering that.
Some conclusion indicators are therefore,
Thus, hence, consequently.
as a result, it follows that, accordingly. This implies that, which means that. In conclusion, how can we use premise and conclusion indicators? Now that you know a bit about what premise and conclusion indicators are and what they do, let's talk about how we can use them. The second step of analyzing an argument is to identify all the premises and conclusions in an argument. Because premise and conclusion indicators help us identify at least some of the premises and conclusions in an argument, we can use premise and conclusion indicators to help us carry out this second step of analyzing an argument. Premise and conclusion indicators can also help you make sure that you accurately identified all and only the statements that make up an argument, which is the first step of analyzing an argument and involves bracketing and numbering all and only the statements that make up an argument. To demonstrate how identifying premise and conclusion indicators can help you carry out the second step of identifying all the premises and conclusions of an argument, as well as to help you ensure that you accurately bracket and number at least some of the statements in an argument, consider the following argument. If truth is important, then people should not lie. Given that people lie all the time, it must be that truth is not important. Pause this video and write down the argument so you can follow the demonstration with me. Now, before we start bracketing and numbering all and only the statements in an argument, we will first begin by identifying all the premise and conclusion indicators. Here are the instructions for how to do so. Pause the video and take a screenshot of these instructions if you think doing so will help you remember. Place any premise or conclusion indicator in parentheses and write a P above each premise indicator and a C above each conclusion indicator. You can also add an arrow next to each P or C to remind you of the direction it indicates. Make sure you only include the word or word phrase that is a premise or conclusion indicator inside the parentheses. Do not include any part of a statement inside any parentheses. After we identify all the premise and conclusion indicators, we will bracket and number each statement, as you did in earlier lessons. Here are the instructions for how to bracket and number the statements in an argument, as a reminder. Pause the video and take a screenshot of these instructions if you think it will help you. 1. Bracket and number each statement, as explained in this lesson, by placing an open bracket at the beginning of each statement and a closed bracket at the end of each statement. No bracket should occur in the middle of any statement, and each open bracket should have a corresponding closed bracket. 2. Each statement that is bracketed and numbered should be a complete sentence, and you should never split a categorical statement, simple statement, negation, disjunction, or conditional statement into two or more statements. 3. You should also, at least for now, always split conjunctions by turning each conjunct of a conjunction into a separate complete statement and making sure to separately bracket and number each conjunct as a complete statement. If you need to remind yourself that each incomplete conjunct is a complete statement, you should rewrite any incomplete conjunct as a complete statement before bracketing and numbering it. 4. When you number statements, always number each statement as you read them and give two or more statements that have the same meaning the same number rather than different numbers. 5. Since premise and conclusion indicators are never a part of a statement, but instead indicate that a statement is either a premise or conclusion, no premise or conclusion indicator should be placed inside a statement bracket. And this should also help you determine whether you accurately bracketed and numbered certain statements, since if you have a premise or conclusion indicator inside a statement bracket, then you did not accurately bracket and number that statement. Because premise and conclusion indicators are also always placed before a statement, they should also help you determine where a certain statement begins. Here is our argument again. If truth is important, then people should not lie. Given that people lie all the time, it must be that truth is not important. Once we identified all the premise and conclusion indicators, we would have the following result. The word phrase,
Given that,
should have a parenthesis around it with the letter P above it, since it is a premise indicator. And the word phrase, it must be that, should be placed in parentheses with the letter C placed above it, since it is a conclusion indicator. We can also place arrows pointing to the right, next to each P and C, to help us remember the direction in which a premise or conclusion indicator indicates. While attending to the premise and conclusion indicators we have placed in parentheses, we can identify the first statement of the argument as the conditional statement. If truth is important, then people should not lie. The second statement begins after the premise indicator.
Given that,
And is the statement. People lie all the time. And the third statement begins after the conclusion indicator. It must be that. And is the statement. Truth is not important. After bracketing all the statements we identified, we can go ahead and number each statement in the order that we read them, and making sure that we give the same statement the same number if it occurs anywhere else in the argument. The statement, if truth is important, then people shouldn't lie, should be labeled with the number 1. The statement, people lie all the time, should be numbered with the number 2. Finally, the statement, truth is not important, should be numbered with the number 3. Now we can use the premise and conclusion indicators to help us identify at least some of the premises or conclusions in an argument by placing a P in front of any statement that is indicated by a premise indicator to be a premise, and by placing a C in front of any statement that is indicated by a conclusion indicator to be a conclusion. If we do so with our argument example, we would place a letter P in front of the statement number for statement 2, since the premise indicator.
Given that,
Is indicating to us that the statement that follows, which is the statement that people lie all the time, is a premise. We would also place the letter C in front of the statement number for statement 3, since the conclusion indicator.
it must be that.
Is indicating to us that the statement, truth is not important, is a conclusion. So, given our ability to identify premise and conclusion indicators, and how to use them to identify premise and conclusions, as well as our knowledge of how to identify statements, we were able to determine that this argument is made up of a total of 3 statements. The conditional statement, if truth is important, then people should not lie. The simple statement, people lie all the time. And the simple statement, truth is not important. We were also able to determine that the conclusion of this argument is statement 3, which is the statement, truth is not important, and that at least one of the premises that is being put forth to support this conclusion as a reason is statement 2, that people lie all the time. Now, the question is whether statement 1, the conditional statement that if truth is important, then people should not lie, is a premise or conclusion. Note that there are no premise or conclusion indicators to help us decide. This is where the third step of analyzing an argument can be helpful, which is to diagram the argument. How diagramming an argument can be helpful. An argument diagram is a visual representation of how the various statements in an argument are related to each other by using the statement numbers that represent each statement and arrows, either with or without a plus sign, to represent how one statement is related to at least one of the other statements in the argument. An accurate diagram of this argument would have statement label 1 next to statement label P2, with a plus sign between them, and both statement labels are underlined. Then an arrow beginning at the middle of that underline points down to statement label C3. This argument diagram also provides a visual representation of the function of each statement in the argument. It tells us that statement 1 and P2 work together to support the conclusion. It also tells us that conclusion C3 is the main conclusion of this argument, and that it is being supported by statement 1 and P2 working together. Diagramming an argument can, therefore, help you figure out whether a statement is a premise or conclusion, especially when there are no premise and conclusion indicators in the sentence containing the argument, because it provides us a way to think about how all the statements of an argument can be related to each other, while also using what we learned from premise and conclusion indicators as clues. When we diagram an argument, we would start with placing what we know about an argument from our argument analysis in the diagram. So, with our example of the argument about truth not being very important, we would start by placing the statement label for what we know is the conclusion of the argument, which we determined by identifying the conclusion indicator. It must be that at the bottom of our diagram. So, the statement label C3, which stands for the conclusion of our argument example, that truth is not important, would be placed at the very bottom of our diagram. Statement labels for any main conclusion of an argument should always be placed at the very bottom of an argument diagram, and all the statement labels for premises should be placed above the statement label of the conclusion that the premises are intended to support. This is because when we add arrows which indicate the kind of support a premise or premises provide for a conclusion or conclusions, those arrows will all point down to those conclusion or conclusions. So, the statement label P2 will be placed above the statement label C3, since, based on the premise indicator,
Given that,
we know that statement P2 is a premise, and a premise's statement label should be placed above the statement label for the conclusion that that premise is intended to support. We are left with statement 1 needing to be placed in our argument diagram, and because we do not have any premise or conclusion indicator for this statement, we can take a look at our diagram and ask ourselves, is statement 1 intended as another main conclusion? In such a case, the statement label for statement 1 would be placed at the bottom of the diagram, next to statement label C3, which would also mean that statement P2 would be intended by the author to be a supporting reason for statement 1, which we can diagram in the following way, with two arrows originating from statement P2, one pointing to statement 1 and the other to statement C3. And this diagram would represent the reasoning that the author of the argument intended to argue that, because of statement P2, people lie all the time. We should conclude not only that P3, truth is not important,
but also that,
if truth is important, then people should not lie. Now, ask yourself, would it make sense for someone to intend this kind of argument? Also, as you think about the answer to this question, you should make sure to use what we philosophers refer to as the principle of charity. This is the principle that when interpreting or trying to understand another person, one should always assume that that person is as reasonable as we are. So, we should always interpret or try to understand another person in the way that makes them out to be as reasonable as we can possibly make them out to be, given what we have to work with. Also note that using the principle of charity to provide the most reasonable interpretation of another person's argument, especially when you are arguing against that argument, is an indication that you are a strong arguer with strong critical thinking skills. To interpret an opposing argument in an uncharitable way is to basically misinterpret that argument, and only people who are not very good at critical thinking and reasoning do such things, since arguing against a misinterpreted argument is essentially arguing against a completely different argument and leaves the actual opposing argument untouched. Notice that with this interpretation of the given argument, although it might make sense for P2, people lie all the time, might be a reason for C3, truth is not important. It doesn't seem to make sense for P2, people lie all the time, to be a reason for statement 1. If truth is important, then people should not lie. As a conclusion, so, statement 1 is most likely not intended by the author of this argument to be another conclusion. This would then mean that statement 1 is most likely intended by the author as a premise. And now the question is, do we think the author intended statement 1 as a premise to work with statement P2 to support the conclusion C3, or to support the conclusion all by itself, in which case, statement P2 would also be supporting the conclusion C3 all by itself? In the first case, our diagram would have statements P1 and P2 working together, which would be presented by a plus sign between the two statement labels and an underline, with a single arrow starting from the middle of the underline, pointing to the conclusions. And this diagram would indicate to us that, according to the author, because statement 1, if truth is important, then people should not lie, and P2, people lie all the time, is also the case, it follows that truth is not important, which is statement C3. In the second case, our diagram would have a single arrow, starting from statement label 1, pointing to statement label C3 as the conclusion of the argument, and another single arrow starting from statement label P2,